Hello, my name is Emily Depew, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. We have 3 more exciting military-related programs coming up this month. On October 17th at 3 o'clock, we'll have Dennis and Ernie Garcia to discuss Dennis's book, Marine Public Servant, Kansan. Our second program will be on October 22nd at 7 o'clock with guest Heath Hardage Lee discussing her book, League of Wives. Our final military-related upcoming program will be on October 24th at 3 o'clock with Lieutenant Colonel Paul Darling. He'll be discussing his book, Taliban Safari, One Day in the Sirkazgan Valley. You can find more details about these events on the back of your program handout. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org, and a video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you're interested. After the presentation, we'll have time for audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and ask one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming the Director of the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Dave Cotter.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's good to see some familiar faces out there. This is the next installment of our lesser-known commanders series that we've been running since last January. Today we're going to hear from Dr. John Hostler, who's a scholar of 12th century warfare. John earned his PhD at from the University of Delaware in 2005, and his list of publications is extensive, but I would like to point out 3 of them just for your awareness. Henry II, A Medieval Soldier of War, which was published in 2007. His book on John of Salisbury, which was published in 2013. And most recently, and to great acclaim, his book on the Siege of Acre, Saladin, Richard the Lionheart, and the Battle that Decided the Third Crusade. Today, John is going to make his presentation is on Philip II of Augustus, another of our little-known commanders. John Hostler.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out today. It's wonderful to be back in Lawrence. Today we're going to take a trip around the world. We're going to France, we're going to England, we're going to Sicily, we're going to the Holy Land, and we're going to the Holy Roman Empire. So we will be all over the place in 12th century and early 13th century medieval Europe. Lord, barons, and knights, we are putting all our faith and hope into God's hands. Otto and his people have been excommunicated by our father, the apostle, because they are the enemies and destroyers of things holy of the church. But we are Christians and follow the dictates of the Holy Church. And even though we are sinners like other men, we nonetheless submit to God and the Holy Church. We guard and defend it with all our ability. And this is why we must fearlessly trust in the compassion of our Lord, who will allow us to overcome our and his enemies and to win. When the king had thus spoken, barons and knights asked for his blessing, and he, with a raised hand, prayed so as to bring the benediction of our Lord over them. They had the trumps and trumpets sound, then attacked their enemies with great and marvelous daring. That's a line from a writer named William the Breton, who wrote a history of King Philip Augustus. And it's the speech Philip Augustus gives before the famous Battle of Bouvines in 1214, which we'll talk about during the lecture today. Philip Augustus is one of the most consequential leaders in the entire Middle Ages. He is unfortunately one of those kings that sometimes falls by the wayside because his story either isn't well known or he gets overshadowed by other people. And the people who overshadow him are the people who are much more familiar to modern audiences. I blame this primarily on Robin Hood. We're talking about King Richard, King John, and their father, Henry II, and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The Devil's Brood, and those famous Angevins who seem to grab up all the press. Philip is the man standing against them at various moments. And what's interesting about him is, when you get right down to it, Philip outlasts them all. If the best revenge is living well, then Philip certainly comes out ahead. He outlasts Henry II and King Richard and King John, takes not all of their territories, but a lot of their territories, and creates what will become the modern nation of France. So he is quite an important person, and today I'd like to go through the moments of his conflicts that are particularly important for the history of warfare in Western Europe. Along the way, we'll encounter some of the personalities involved, his great counterparts that you likely know a little bit about, and talk about his personal life to some extent as well. But we're going to focus on how he regained land for the territory of France. Now, as you see on the screen, Philip comes from a line that is sort of interesting. A man named Louis VII, his father, who was married to 3 different women. Philip is the son of his third and final wife. But if you look there, it's Louis VII's first wife that's really famous, right? There's Eleanor of Aquitaine, right? She and Louis VII had been married, had lived together for some time, and she had given him children, but they were, to his distress, all girls. And so the conclusion was reached that maybe this marriage wasn't supposed to be happening, and there were excuses made, and some legal hurdles were jumped, and they ended up annulling the marriage, and Eleanor of Aquitaine was free to find a new husband, and she found it in King Henry II of England, who would become the king a couple years after they got married. Right? So Louis VII would move on, and eventually, from Adela of Champagne, Philip II would be born. Right? Now, Philip himself is going to be king for an awfully long time. If you look at those regnal years, and technically he's actually crowned in 1179, he is the king for over 40 years. His father was the king for even longer. So you're talking about very long reigns of these monarchs, and this is sort of a French tradition in this period. This is one of the successors to Philip II. A couple seats after will be the famous King Louis IX of France, who will also reign for quite a long time. And so there's a lot of time in the saddle here, and a lot of experience that is being gained and passed down. Now, in imitation of his father, probably not in strict imitation, but as it happens, Philip II will also have 3 wives. Right? And this early part of his career is a little bit contentious because he comes out looking like not a very nice man at all. What we know about Philip in his early years is that he was sickly, that he was thin, that he was pale, that he seemed kind of a stranger and a little different than everyone else. But nonetheless, he had some powerful supporters. And when he does enter into marriage arrangements, they are going to provide him heirs, but they're going to get him into a lot of controversy as well. His first wife, Isabella, her full name is, we refer to her as Isabella of Hainaut because she comes from the region of Hainaut up in Flanders. She's going to provide him with his heir, the future King Louis VIII. And that will be from his first wife. And then she will give birth to 2 more boys, Robert and Philip, in the year 1190, in March of 1190. And so it looks like Isabella is almost like Eleanor of Aquitaine, where they are producing sons at this record rate. Unfortunately, Isabella dies in childbirth while giving birth to those twin boys, and then they die a few days after. So after this first marriage, Philip is left with only 1 son, 1 heir, right? Which convinces him that he needs to get married again. And the reason he married his next wife is not completely unknown, but there's a lot of guessing and no one really knows for sure, because she's a princess of Denmark named Ingeborg. And people at the time said, Denmark, why Denmark? Right? There's so many wealthy and powerful kingdoms around. Denmark doesn't give any kind of strategic advantage. There's not much wealth to be gained from this marriage, and so no one really knows why it happened. But we know what happened on the day of their marriage, which is one of the strangest things that I've read about in the 12th century in terms of married royal couples. He marries Ingeborg on August 14th, 1193. That's the same day he met her. He meets her in the morning. They get married later that evening. But during the ceremony, he apparently goes quite pale during the ceremony and starts trembling as if he's very uneasy, right? leaves the marriage ceremony, and then on the very same day abandons her, sends her off to a monastery where she'll live for 7 years. They never actually found their way to the marriage bed. He completely disowns her. She didn't really do anything wrong. People look at her reputation and say, well, she seems to have everything in line. There's nothing that happened. This is on Philip, and it's kind of a mystery as to why he did this, right? So he refuses to see her for 7 years, tries to get an annulment from his uncle, the Archbishop William of Rheims, gets one, which seemingly frees himself up to marry a third woman named Agnes, who he had had his eye on. Then this one makes much more political sense. There was more to be gained from this. She bears him a daughter and another son named Philip, and it seems like Philip has everything going for him now. The only problem is that this wins him the ire of the Pope, who happens to be the most powerful Pope of the Middle Ages, Pope Innocent III. And this results in the interdict of France and Philip's run-ins with the church, and it's quite a bad scene. And so there's a lot of back and forth as he tries to sort out his personal life. Now, fortunately for Philip, while he's sorting out his personal life, he's dealing with a counterpart over in England who has, if not equally bad, worse problems with his family, and that's King Henry II of England, whose biographer, W.L. Warren, called the man of many wiles, riffing off a line from the poet Ovid. Right? And there he is, Peter O'Toole, Katharine Hepburn in The Lion in Winter, right? The Oscar-winning production, right? And then at the bottom you see his eldest son, eldest surviving son, King Richard the Lionheart, with, there he is, Philip Augustus, played by the future James Bond, Timothy Dalton. Okay. Now, Henry II is very famous for his problems with his sons. Very famous for it. They're known collectively as the Devil's Brood because they are constantly rebelling against him. The one we know most famously is Richard, because Richard is the one who outlasts his father and lives to tell the tale. But in reality, all of his sons rebel against him at one point or another, some of them multiple times. Right? They all get their comeuppance in one way or another, but the idea here is that Henry II is sort of beset with problems as he deals with his family. Now that's on the one hand. Right? He's got problems with his family, they are rebelling against him, and he frequently has to march out and put his own sons down in combat. Right? Every time he does, he brings them back into the warmth of his embrace, he forgives them. Right? And then a couple years go by and they rebel against him once again, right? Seeking territory, seeking wealth. So he's got that issue on the one side, but on the other side, what he has that Philip does not have in his early days is that Henry II is gobbling up huge chunks of territory. He becomes a major landowner in Europe and arguably the most powerful man in Europe in the 1160s, 1170s, and 1180s. He owns more territory than the King of France. It's not even close. I'll show you on a map in a second. He owns as much territory as the Holy Roman Empire, and he probably has more money at his disposal and more loyal subjects. So this is a very powerful man that Philip will have to contend against. His father, Louis VII, had tried to contend against him as well and had failed over and over and over and over again. Henry II had abused Louis VII back and forth, had consistently waged campaigns against him, over 30 campaigns, and had come out on top every single time. So the French record against Peter O'Toole is not great. They're not doing too well against this guy. Philip is going to try his hand in the 1180s. Okay. Once he's crowned in 1179, he has some early hurdles to get past, but eventually he's going to try his hand, and he actually does all right against Henry II. In the spring of 1187, he moves against Henry, and it's an indecisive result in the northern part of the country. In the summer of 1188, he loses. In the summer of 1189, he wins. Now, the last one is the most famous, probably because of The Lion in Winter, but also because of sort of vestiges of the Robin Hood tale. In 1189, Philip allies with Richard the Lionheart in a military alliance against Henry II. And this is the one where Henry is being chased out of the city of Le Mans. It's burning behind him. He retreats to the castle of Chinon, which is his famous stronghold, and dies in June of 1189, bleeding from the nose and finding out at his last breath that not only his son Richard has betrayed him, but also his son John. Right, the one who had previously been loyal. He had one son who had never rebelled, and he finds out, no, actually all of them have rebelled. Right? And there's that famous line in the movie where he says, I've lost my boys. I've lost my boys. Right? He just realizes his sons have all turned against him. Okay? So that's who Philip has to contend with. First Henry II, and he does all right. But now that Henry II has died, and now that Henry II's older sons have died, the ones you don't hear about as much, Henry the Younger, the young king, who dies in 1183, and then Geoffrey, who dies in 1186. Geoffrey was sort of the hope of the crown. You're left fighting against Richard the Lionheart, King Richard I. That will be the man that Philip will have to contend with. Richard the Lionheart is one of the most famous warriors in English history. Whether or not he deserves that reputation is a matter of great debate. I've gotten not into shouting matches with other scholars about it, but it gets pretty intense back and forth. Right? People who see him as this great chivalric warrior, the leader of the crusade. Richard is the only English king to actually lead armies in the Holy Land. He's the only one. Edward I was in the Holy Land as well, but he was not king yet when he did it. So this is the great crusading king. He is the man who fought against Saladin, the famous Kurdish general. And so that's the man you're going to have to take on if you're Philip. And if you juxtapose their reputations, Philip, who is seen as kind of, pale, a little weak, a little confused a lot of the times, sort of out of his depth, out of his element, and Richard, the stout chivalric warrior who everybody loves, that the poets like to sing about, it would seem to be no contest. And for most of the reign, it really isn't. Philip and Richard are ill-matched. Richard is going to get the better of him over and over again. But remember, as I said at the beginning, the best revenge is living well. Now, you may not be able to beat Richard, but Richard's not going to be around that long, and eventually you get to face off against that King John character. And that's where Philip's going to be able to make most of his moves. One of the great historians of Philip the Augustus, a man by the name of John Baldwin, who taught at Johns Hopkins University, makes great hay out of the idea that Philip was the plotting kind. He knew that to beat England, he had to turn the younger members of the family against each other. And he does this over long stretches of time. So Philip is in it for the long haul. He's not a man to go in and try to grab a victory right away to win everything. There is no decisive victory to win the war against England. The idea is you play your cards right, you play on personalities, you turn allies against each other, and you hang around until the very end. And that's what Philip ends up doing. And that's where we'll end up at by the time we get to the end of the talk, with Philip holding all the cards and most of the land because he was able to outlast everyone. But in the meantime, before you have to outlast people, you do have to deal with the crises of the day. And in the 1180s, the main crisis is the problems in the east. On July 4th, 1187, the famous warrior Saladin had destroyed the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at a place called the Horns of Hattin, west of the Sea of Galilee in the Holy Land. With that army destroyed, it became very clear that Jerusalem, which had been owned by the Christians for 88 years to that point, was under dire threat. With no army to protect it, it was a sitting duck. It was only a matter of time before Saladin came to the Holy City and decided to invest it. When news of Hattin reaches Rome, the Pope at the time, Pope Urban III, reportedly hears the news that Saladin has been successful and dies instantly of a heart attack. Just falls over. Jerusalem is lost. Oh, dead. Right? Very shocking thing. And so very quickly, news spreads throughout Europe that we have to launch a new expedition to save Jerusalem from Saladin. Right? If you look at the sources, most people didn't really believe Jerusalem could be saved when they hear about Hattin. They kind of figure it's already gone. There's no way we'll get to it before Saladin, but maybe we can put an army together and reclaim Jerusalem from the Ayyubid Sultan. And so that results in the grand campaign that will be known as the Third Crusade. Sometimes known as was one of the King's Crusades, because like the Second Crusade before it, the heads of state are going to go along on this one. Now, Henry II takes the crusading oath because they get the news in 1187, and in 1188 the kings are going to make promises to go on this crusade. Henry, of course, will die before he gets to go. He never gets a chance to go to the east. He made many promises over his time, over his long reign, to go to the east, and he never actually goes. Right? Philip takes the cross, and along with Henry, promises to provide enormous financial support for the Third Crusade. The most famous of these supports is a tax known as the Saladin tithe, issued in 1188. Right? The tithe to, penny on the pound to fight against Saladin. This is levied not only, it's levied most strongly in England, where tens of thousands of pounds are going to be extracted from the local population to pay for mercenaries, to pay for weapons, to pay for transport to the Holy Land. But Philip is also going to levy the tax in France. And it seems to be he does it because he doesn't want to look like he's not playing the game, right? So Henry says, I'm going to raise 30,000 pounds. And then Philip, supposedly his eyes grow wide, and he's like, that's a lot of money. Holy crap, I don't know. And then eventually says, okay, I'll raise some money too, but more because he's guilted into it than anything. And for this reason and others, Philip is sometimes characterized as a reluctant crusader, a man who takes the cross, who makes grand promises and goes to the Holy Land, but the question that lingers is always, how committed was this guy? Was he really committed to the cause, or did he go along just for political advantage? So Henry and Philip take the cross. They were actually late in taking it. Richard the Lionheart took the cross the year before in 1187. He didn't even wait to consult his father. He was ready to go. Richard is this great crusading guy, right? So here you have two kings and the heir to the English throne who are ready to go on crusade. Henry II dies, and so it's going to be Philip and Richard who go. The First Crusade begins in 1189. This is when the major portions of the army go to the Holy Land. Philip and Richard get there a little late. They have matters to take care of in their kingdoms, and they're a little bit slow getting out of the box. They take these circuitous paths, first marching through France, and then ending up at Marseille, and then sailing for points further into the Mediterranean. Richard gets to the city of Marseille and then sails to Messina, Sicily. Richard sails to Genoa. So they have two armies, the French army and the English army, that are purportedly going together, but they're kind of taking different routes there. Eventually, both of them will arrive at Acre, which is the scene of the heaviest fighting of the Third Crusade. But they're going to get there very late. The Siege of Acre begins in 1189, and the kings arrive in 1191, about a year and a half into the process. Philip gets there first on April of 1191. He gets there first. Richard will not arrive until June because Richard runs into some extra problems on the way. There's a story of a shipwreck, and his bride-to-be is cast upon the shores of Cyprus, and so Richard has to go to Cyprus to rescue his sweetheart, and along the way conquers the very Christian Cypriot kingdom on his way to the Holy Land. So we always laugh about Richard. We say, well, this great holy Christian crusader who kills Christians on the way to the crusade. It's one of those dilemmas there, right? But Philip doesn't have that problem. He sails directly to the Holy Land. He arrives at Tyre to meet with one of his allies, Conrad de Montferrat, the Marquis, and then sails to the Siege of Acre and arrives there in April 1191 and finds, when he gets there, a very distressing situation. There you see, that's Acre in a 13th century drawing in a manuscript by a man named Marin Sanudo. Kind of shows you the layout of the city. It's this wonderful peninsula surrounded by fortifications. He gets there and realizes that all of the Crusaders have been there for quite some time and have fought a number of battles and have attacked the walls multiple times. They haven't actually broken into the city yet. The lines that he has are just fantastic. I mean, he gets there, they're written in Old French, they're written in Latin, but you get the sense he arrives and he just looks at people and shakes his fist and says, "What have you been doing? You've been here a year and a half, and you haven't broken into this little city? What is wrong with you?" And so very quickly, Philip takes control of the siege operations and starts to redirect the energies of the Christian warriors against the Siege of Acre. Right? And that means redirecting them away from the forces of Saladin. Now, one of the problems at Acre is that as the Christian army is here, surrounding the city, trying to break in through the walls, beyond them on the Acre plain is Saladin's Egyptian army, probably 25 to 30,000 soldiers strong. So if you're the Crusaders, you're kind of trapped. You're trapped between the city, which is being held by a Muslim garrison, and then you're fighting off attacks from Saladin in the north from a Muslim relief army. So between the two, you are outnumbered and you have multiple dilemmas. This leads the Crusaders to build ramparts around their camps. They dig ditches and they build wooden walls to protect themselves from attack. So Philip gets there and says, okay, you've been spending a lot of time fighting against Saladin. That's great, but you're not going to win that battle. Why not? Let's get into Acre. And so he lines up the catapults and he arranges the battering rams and he orders the French soldiers, along with the other contingents that are there, the Italians, the Danes, the Germans, the Flemish. And it's quite the multi-regional force. And he urges them to attack the walls, and this they do. It's under Philip's leadership that Acre's walls finally start to bend and buckle a little bit. From the accounts, we see that little pieces of stone are flying off and little holes are being made. There's tunneling attempts as French sappers are trying to go underneath the wall and collapse it from underground. Right? And all of this is taking place under Philip's direct leadership. He is the head of the army. He is the French king on the scene. After Philip has been putting in all of this hard work, guess who shows up? Richard the Lionheart, the famous Crusader king. A little late to the party. As soon as Richard steps on shore, problems begin. Now, I should stress that these two men had had a cordial relationship before the crusade. They had teamed up together against King Henry II of England. They had gone to war together. There was an allegation that they had slept together. One of the chronicle sources written by a parson named Roger claims that they shared the same bed. Scholars still aren't sure if that's true or not, but it's out there. So these are two guys who are close. They know each other quite well. Right? And yet at Acre, that is all forgotten. They have competing interests. As soon as Richard steps off the boat onto the shore, he gathers people around and says, all of you who have been paid 1 gold piece by the King of France to fight for him, I'll give you 2. I'll give you more money than Philip. And instantly people say, oh, this is a jackpot, right? So they all go running over to Richard and they join his side. And you can imagine Philip kind of standing there like, what the heck is going on? Where are all my soldiers going, right? Factionalism starts to occur as well. There's certain groups of soldiers who, from various regions, who are very keen to ally themselves with Philip because they have interests with France. And then there are others, such as the people from some of the Italian districts, who say, well, our interests are really more with Richard. And so the Crusade army starts to kind of take sides. And they're both attacking the city. You've got the English contingent and the Normans over here with their allies and the French over here. And they're both assaulting the city, but they are not working together. Not at all. At one point, Philip gets so mad at Richard, he actually dons a suit of armor and grabs some soldiers and rushes out to attack the English king. And that's how bad it gets. And his retainers have to hold him back. You don't want to do this. Remember who the enemy is here. It's not each other, right? So it's a very contentious situation. In time, in July 1191, the walls of Acre are indeed collapsed. They are collapsed not by Richard the Lionheart. There's a lot of press in the sources about Richard's great catapults. You read about his wonderful trebuchets that he built. One of them, he was so big, he took the mast from a ship, and he had specially hardened stones from Sicily that he threw against the wall, right? And so Richard can be, oh, he's the guy who's breaking through the wall. But it's not actually Richard. It was French sappers, French tunnelers who managed to go under and collapse the wall. That's how the Crusaders get into the city. So who really takes the city of Acre in the end? It's Philip Augustus. Philip is the victor at Acre. That one idea is surprisingly muted in almost every study I've read of the Third Crusade. Richard gets the credit for this, and Philip does not. I think there's a reason why. After the siege, you can see on the timeline here, the fighting is over in July. The surrender arrangements are agreed upon. And once that happens, Philip gathers some of his men, gets back on ships, sails first to Tyre, and then returns to France. He leaves the crusade, claiming that his vow to rescue the Holy Land has been fulfilled. Now, that action is absolutely torn apart in the medieval sources. You have to be careful on which ones you look at. If you look at the English sources, they call him a coward. You're running away. Right? They call him a blasphemer. You have broken your oath to God. If you read the Norman sources, they're just as antagonistic because the Normans are sided with the English. Right? It's only in the French sources where you have all kinds of rational, reasonable explanations for his departure. Right? Oh, no, well, his son was sick, which is true, although his son had gotten better already. Right? He had vital affairs to attend to in France. Maybe. Right? It's all kinds of excuses thrown out by the French authors. Right? So when people look at the panoply of the sources, they have, I think, come to the conclusion that Philip ran away. Right? He's like in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, run away, right? That's the idea. And whereas Richard, what does he do? He stays in the Holy Land. He continues to fight. He fights a battle at Arsuf directly against Salonine's men, and he wins. He marches on Jerusalem, and he doesn't get it back, but at least he tries. Right? And so Richard becomes the great crusading king, and Philip fades into the background. Absolutely fades into the background. Even though at the Siege of Acre, he is the one who gets the victory. And the importance of Acre should not be understated. because Jerusalem was in Muslim hands, this becomes the new capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and will remain the capital until the last crusader is finally expelled from the Holy Land in 1291. It becomes the primary entry point for all Christian pilgrims coming to visit the Holy City. It becomes a major trade port. It becomes a very cosmopolitan center. Lots of manuscripts are produced there. It really becomes kind of this intellectual hub in the Holy Land. That is due to Philip's leadership. And he usually doesn't get any credit for it, right? So going with the theme of the current Dole Institute series of generals you have never heard of, this is one of the reasons why. Here's a man who won a great victory on one of the most prominent stages in the entire medieval period, and people kind of forget about it. Until today. We brought him back today. Thank goodness. But that's not the end to Philip's warfare. He's on a boat back to France, where he does indeed have some business to attend to. And that business is awfully convenient because his chief rival in Western Europe, Richard the Lionheart, is where? He's still on the crusade, right? When the cat's away, the mice will play. So Richard is 3,000 kilometers that way. Philip now has some opportunity to do some political maneuvering on his own. Right? The English sources accuse him of this directly. They say he went back specifically to try to take lands away from the English throne. That may well have been the case. He was certainly an opportunist. Right? Now, to do this, he's going to have to work through those English sovereigns that are still in the land. Richard's on crusade, but his younger brother, John, again from, thank you, Lion in Winter. Right? There's John. He is back there conniving, looking to seize power for himself. And you just have to think of any version of the Robin Hood movie. Pick your favorite one. That Prince John, that's who we're talking about. My children and I watched the Disney Robin Hood one last weekend, which is my favorite one. Right? Prince John with Sir Hiss, and it's wonderful, right? It's all about gold, gold, taxes, taxes, right? There's a lot of truth in that, right? He's not just doing it for money, but he is scheming to well position himself because there is a chance that Richard never comes back from crusade. I mean, it is possible. A lot of people die in the Holy Land. Right? A lot of crusaders went. The death toll that I've calculated so far for the Third Crusade is easily in excess of 30,000 Christian soldiers. It's a lot of people. There's a good chance Richard might not make it back, especially because everyone knows by this point that Richard had fallen deathly ill at the Siege of Acre and had been bedridden for a long time. And that illness is one that kind of recurs. So there's the thought, well, if my brother never comes back, then England is mine. Philip starts scheming with John. He starts scheming with him. Okay? And the deal that's going to be hatched essentially is, John, if you give me some buffer territory that I've always had my eyes on, it's called the Norman Vexin. It's the space of land along the Seine, which is between Normandy and the Ile-de-France. Right? It's been fought over for decades. Right? John, if you give me this buffer zone between myself and Normandy, right, then I will help you out. I will do what I can to help your cause. And so John makes the deal. And that deal for the Vexin is copied down and put in the French archives, and multiple copies are made. This is a promise that will not be forgotten. Right? And as long as Richard's away, this kind of scheming is going to go on. Right? Now, Richard is trying to get back home, as you also probably know from the Robin Hood story, right? He sails back towards Europe, and he shipwrecks off the coast of Venice, and gets taken prisoner by a man named Duke Leopold of Austria, and then turned over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor is in correspondence with Philip Augustus. And Philip writes to the emperor and says, hold on to that guy as long as you can. You keep him in jail for as long as you want to. We're just fine over here. And so Richard stays imprisoned until 1194. He spends almost 2 years in imprisonment. Right? And the scheming continues and continues, right? But Richard does eventually come back. We all know that is the ending to Robin Hood, right? Prince John will get his just desserts, and Sean Connery or whoever it is that's playing King Richard in whatever movie is going to return, and everything will be fine, right? John is humiliated. He scrapes and bows in front of his brother, who treats him like a little child and essentially says, you've been naughty, go take a time out, and all will be forgiven. And then Richard turns his attention on Philip. Now, Philip has been campaigning around the western regions of what we would call today France. He's been moving around in the Norman regions, around Anjou, around Maine, and these other districts. And Richard is going to go and oust Philip from all of those positions. Starting in 1194, there's a series of campaigns that go on for about 4 years, and at every turn, Richard defeats Philip. either through direct combat or through marching his army into the right place. He is shoving him off everywhere he goes. Right? Philip was a match for John. Philip is not a match for Richard the Lionheart. When it comes to fighting each other, he very clearly loses. And the exclamation mark that's put on this is when Richard builds a castle to protect against further incursions of the French called Chateau Gaillard, which is the very famous Norman fortress on the River Seine, right? Thought to be impregnable at the time. Right? So it looks like Philip has been outmaneuvered. Right? Fortunately for him, Richard the Lionheart doesn't live very long. He's killed in 1199, only 10 years after becoming king. And he's killed by a crossbow bolt through the shoulder that turns gangrenous, and it's the disease that gets him, the infection, not the actual wound itself. The story is, as we like to tell it, is there's a French archer on top of a castle who has a crossbow in one hand and a frying pan in the other, and he's taking pot shots at the English. And he'd shoot them with the crossbow, and when the English returned fire, he'd smack the arrow out of the sky with a frying pan. And Richard says, "Oh, what a noble man! I would really love to see this guy in action." And he goes up, "Sir, you are such a noble." Shoots him, right? The king gets shot as a result. So Richard is going to die, and that's great for Philip because now who does he have to contend with? John, who is widely regarded as one of the worst, if not the worst king in English history. And that is a pretty distinguished line of bad rulers, if you want to say who the bad kings were, right? For John to top it, you really have to be great, okay? So Philip has someone who is intellectually inferior to him and someone who does not have nearly the combat prowess and savvy that he does. Okay? There have been some historians who have been tried to rehabilitate John and say, "Oh, he wasn't so bad. He was actually a better leader than we thought." They're all wrong. Nobody's accepted these explanations. John was terrible. He was awful, right? And so this is who you get to work against. And once again, Philip falls back to this long-term scheming project, right? Richard the Lionheart did not have a legitimate son. John seems the likely candidate because he's the brother of Richard, but there is another candidate. There's this guy named Arthur, young Arthur, who is the son of Richard and John's brother, Geoffrey. Geoffrey, who was the most courteous of chivalric knights, who had unfortunately died in the middle of a tournament when playtime got a little too rough and he gets clubbed and stomped to death, right? But he had a son named Arthur. And so Philip starts offering Arthur some allegiance. "Arthur, maybe I'll give you some of the lands of England in return for your allegiance. Maybe we can make you the next king," which stirs up hostilities between Arthur and John. John is the uncle, Arthur is his nephew, right? Once again, the Plantagenets are fighting with each other, and Philip is scheming behind it all. So it's through these methods that he's going to tweak the situation to his advantage. And the result of this is that Philip is going to retake, over the course of the 1180s and the 1190s and into the 13th century, an awful lot of territory that had not belonged to the King of France previously. Okay? And so some of this we're backing up a little bit to his early days, but the idea here is to look at the stretch of time in which he's operating. Right? You see here, this is the Ile-de-France. That is the French king's territory. That's it. That's all the French king owns in the late 12th century, compared to all of these other territories owned by other people. And what Philip will do is gradually start to grab little pieces of this as he goes along. Some of them come from marriages, some of them come from warfare, some of them come from scheming. But the idea is he's going to piece it together bit by bit. So in 1180, he marries Isabel of Hainaut, and he's going to get Artois. Fantastic. That puts you up north in the county of Flanders, which is strategically a vital place, and it's an economic powerhouse as well. It's a good place to be. In 1186, after Isabella dies, he gets part of Vermandois, which is her inheritance. Now he has to fight against her relative, Baldwin V, the Count of Hainaut, to get it, and that takes several years to sort out. But eventually, he is going to grab part of Vermandois. In 1187, he gets part of Berry in the south. He takes that from Henry II. That's a crucial buffer zone between France and the county of Toulouse in the south, which had always been antagonistic against the throne. In 1191, after the Crusade, he gets more of Vermandois. This is after the death of the Count of Flanders, Philip of Alsace, who had died at the Siege of Acre. In 1194, that's that deal with John. There's the Vexin. That's that borderland between Paris here and the Norman Peninsula over here. And he gets that by scheming with John. And by the year 1200, he's received the rest of Vermandois by more maneuvering. So already, just up through the year 1200, you can see what Philip has done, right? Through marriages, through some war fighting, through alliances, through scheming, and what some English historians might call outright trickery. He manages to grab these territories that are peripheral to his own, and he's building out his presence. He's building it out. The big pieces, though, are going to come in direct military acquisition. Okay? And those are the pieces that are the real prizes, the ancestral territories of the kings of England. First of these is the Dukedom of Normandy, which had belonged to William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror, when he had conquered England in 1066, linked these two kingdoms together, or one kingdom and one duchy together. And then under Henry II, these other major territories are added. Henry brought the county of Anjou with him, acquires Maine, the Dukedom of Brittany, Poitou, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the huge chunk of Aquitaine in the south. So all of these constitute what we sometimes call the Angevin Empire, this huge piece of territory that gave the English king his real revenue sources. Right? England is nice to have. England is a wealthy kingdom. It's compact, it's controllable, but the real money is on the continent. And that's where the English kings had always gotten it from. What Philip needs to do, if he really wants to move ahead and outflank his opponents, is to get his hands on these things. And this he does. He uses an excuse to do it. In 1200, King John decides he wants to get married. He marries a woman who's already betrothed, Isabel of Angoulême. She's betrothed to the Count of Lusignan, Hugh Le Brun. John steps in and says, I'd make a much better match. I'm a king, right? You can marry a count, but I'm a king. It's good to be king, as Mel Brooks used to say, right? And so this is over. Busted up. That betrothal is over. The Lusignan family, who is a very powerful regional family, they fight against John, and that's a fight they're going to lose. Right? And this is where Philip steps in. Philip steps in and says, as my feudal subject, which John technically is, says, you must come to Paris to answer the charge of meddling in the affairs of the Lusignan families. If John goes to Paris, probably be put on trial and found guilty. That's a sucker's play. He's never going to go. So he refuses to go. And so Philip says, well, I have given you an order to appear before me. You have refused my order. That means that your territories, I now declare forfeit. You lose control over those. Right? Now come the invasions. Because these are legally forfeit, at least according to Philip's design, the French armies are going to move in and claim them for France. Right? 1203. Maine and Anjou. These are the ancestral Plantagenet lands. They are gone, including the capital of Angers. Right? 1203 as well, you're going to lose Maine. 1204, the Dukedom of Normandy is going to be retaken by the French, and that ends the formal English possession of that duchy. That will be fought over more in the coming years. If you're familiar with Henry V and the 100 Years' War, Normandy becomes a bone of contention again eventually. Right? But for now, it is gone. Right? Poitou, gone in 1205, and finally in 1206, the Dukedom of Brittany. So what has Philip done by the time you get to 1206? He has not only added, there's the Ile-de-France, the royal domain, he's not only added the areas in Artois and Vermandois and down in Berry and in other places, but he's added this entire western section. Right? Pretty good for a man who's not supposed to be a great commander. Right? Pretty solid acquisitions. The only thing left to John, and by virtue of that, the Kingdom of England, besides England and its territories in the Isles, are Gascony in the south, a little bit of Aquitaine, and the Channel Islands, which are nice, but they're not Normandy. This loss of Normandy in 1204 has been the subject of many, many books. It's a big deal because this age of the Normans had sort of, in one sense, come to an end. Now, John cannot let this stand. He has to respond. Not just because he's lost these territories, but he has to respond for the benefit of his own vassals. His men are the ones who actually own the farms in these places. They own territories and they collect tax revenues from there. That is their land, and he's supposed to protect that land as king. He's going to have to move in, and he's going to have to try to get these things back. He doesn't have enough power to do it by himself, and so he's going to find allies. To do that, he has to reach across France and over to the Holy Roman Empire and ally himself with the emperor by the name of Otto IV, otherwise known as Otto of Brunswick. from the Welf family. The idea is this: Otto IV and the imperial soldiers will come into France from the east. John and the English soldiers will come from the south up to Paris. They'll meet together, and together in an allied force will defeat Philip Augustus, and from that point unwind all of these conquests. Right? It's a little bit like Waterloo, if you think about it. Right? The French and the Germans and the English all coming together in a spot that's really not that far away from Waterloo. Right? The only problem is John's forces get delayed in the south of France. They're down by La Rochelle, and then they move to Nantes, and then back to La Rochelle, and he's spending so much time in the south, he never gets up north to meet with his ally Otto. And so unlike at Waterloo, where all the armies come together at the right time, at the famous Battle of Bouvines, July 27th, 1214, it's only going to be the Otto IV and some of his English allies against Philip Augustus. Right? The Battle of Bouvines, I would argue, is one of the most consequential battles of the entire Middle Ages. The ramifications of Philip's victory there are substantial and affect the continent in all sorts of different ways. At Bouvines, you see the graph here. Here's the imperial forces in the blank boxes, including the Earl of Salisbury, one of the English allies, Emperor Otto IV and his Flemish soldiers, and then here's King Philip down here with his allies. Philip had actually been crossing the bridge away from Bouvines. Half of his army was across the bridge when he found out that the imperial forces were advancing. He has to very quickly get those forces back across and array them in time to meet the opponents that are marching at him. There's some discussion about whether this battle should have ever taken place because the imperial forces are quite concerned that this is a Sunday. You're not supposed to be fighting on Sundays. So there is some discussion about that. But in time, it actually does take place. Philip is going to win the Battle of Bouvines. He's going to smash the forces of Otto apart. Otto will be wounded in the battle. He will get away, but he's lost all political credibility and will be forced to humiliatingly abdicate the throne in the wake of Bouvines. So Bouvines actually removes an emperor from his throne. It also means, because John has lost his major imperial supporter, there's no more allies for King John. There's no other place for him to go to get soldiers. He's not going to get Normandy back. He's not going to get Anjou back. He's not going to get Brittany back. Bouvines confirms that the English have lost these vast territories. Okay? So, an emperor unthroned, the end of John's territorial ambitions. And there's other impacts as well. When John gets back to England, he has to explain to his barons, yes, I lost your territory a few years ago. I know that. Stop reminding me. I tried to get them back, but things didn't work out so great, and I'm sorry, I still don't have them. Right? This, combined with a whole host of domestic disputes, leads to a baronial uprising against John. They demand satisfaction. John's a smart guy in his own way. As his barons rise up in revolt, he very coyly takes the cross and promises to go on crusade. One of the tricks in the 13th century is you could indemnify yourself against legal judgments by taking the cross. Become a crusader, and all of a sudden, nobody can have a claim against you. Right? The barons don't buy this. They break out in revolt, and so John is forced to, especially after they attack his royal castle at Northampton, John is forced to sit down with his barons, and the result of this is the Great Charter, Magna Carta, which is agreed upon on June 10th, 1215. Right? So the Battle of Bouvines, Philip's great victory, is a major portion of the reason why Magna Carta happens. And we can talk later, if you like, about the importance of Magna Carta and what it has meant in the legal history of the West. In the empire, Otto IV is out. He will be replaced by a man named Frederick II. And Frederick II, when he is on the throne, will take moves to grant extraordinary privileges to the German princes, giving them control over their own lands. It's in a 1231 document known as the Constitution in Favor of the Princes. In order to consolidate his power in Sicily, Emperor Frederick gives his princes free reign in Germany. That is the beginning of this collection of German states that are fiercely independent of each other and always fighting against each other all the way up until the 19th century. So again, Bouvines, by removing Otto IV, has consequences in the Holy Roman Empire. It also sends Frederick II down to Sicily, where he will be crowned king of Sicily and brings a German presence to the south. And eventually, Frederick II, using the resources of Sicily and southern Italy, will take a crusading army to the Holy Land and capture Jerusalem in 1229. So if we conceive of Bouvines as sort of the spark behind all this, Philip wins. John's success is over. He has to give up power and agree to Magna Carta. France becomes a powerful nation. German emperorship changes hands. Sicily is conquered. The Holy Land is restored. That's a lot of consequence for one battle. I think we can fairly call that decisive. And the credit goes to Philip. He's the one who gave that inspirational address that we started with. He's the one who led the troops to victory. So what then do we make of Philip Augustus? And what's his role with this last category, the nation of France? Well, there are no nations in the 13th century. That's a bit of a more modern concept, right? But there is something to the idea of Philip bringing about something that is new. This idea of France and its emergence as a major power. Territorially, this is France's great coming out party. It is. They've gone from small kingdom to large kingdom. Paris becomes an important city under Philip Augustus. This is when the walls are built around both the left and the right banks of Paris. This is when all the chief liberties for the University of Paris are issued during his reign in the year 1200. And also you start to see it a little different in the way that the kingship is described. This is the seal of Philip Augustus. And if you look at this here, it says, Francorum Rex. Francorum Rex. Now that's a very important phrase because what it means is king of the Franks. And his kingdom, Regnum Francorum, kingdom of the Franks. Now before Philip, France has always just been referred to as the regnum, the king's direct holding. Whatever the king owned for himself, that was France. Now the idea is, that's France, but all the other areas where Philip has some kind of control and authority, that's France too. And that's a real mind shift that people go through. So now if you're living in a place like Anjou, the stage is set to stop thinking so much about yourself as an Angevin and maybe more as a Frenchman. That's a long, slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. It goes on and on and on all the way up until the French Revolution. Right? But the idea that the seeds of nationhood are sowed by Philip's successful conquest is a fairly compelling one. And what that means is that his military exploits are the things that really propelled France into the spotlight. From this point forward, it's not going to be England large in power and France down here. It is very much going to shift, and France will have the larger armies, and France will have the larger revenues, and France will be more politically influential across Europe. So hopefully, that little bit about Philip Augustus, you will consider him, as I consider him, as one of those most important generals that unfortunately doesn't get talked about very much. But after today, I hope you know a little bit more about him, and I certainly welcome any questions you may have. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, does King Philip also have anything to do with the crusading you see against the people in the area of Occitan?
The Albigensian Crusade?
Yes.
Yeah, he's tertiary to the efforts there because that crusade begins in 1209. And so he's definitely involved. He's not leading any forces down there, but he's definitely involved down there. And there's very strong anti-heresy proclamations being made in the early 13th century. And he is, in order to sort out things with the ecclesiastical authorities, he makes promises, I will crush heresy where I find it, those sorts of things. And so he is involved, and there is funding that is provided, and he's linked to the activity down there, but not leading armies himself. Yeah.
Yes, what about the finances of John? You know, the ransom they had to pay for Richard the Lionheart.
Right.
Get him out.
Yes.
And then his war, and then you had the taxes, then it seemed like the English barons were just being taxed to death.
Yes.
And so did that have an effect upon the army that he sent to France?
It did. And the taxes that are happening, there's a lot of taxation, which was common, but it's the kind of insidious fundraising that's going on as well. It's direct taxes, it's fees, it's tolls, it's payments for various liberties. It seems like at the time there's kind of royal officials crawling through every town in England, extracting money. You know, that image of the Sheriff of Nottingham, right? I mean, it's overblown, but there's some sensibility there, right? Seems like the royal officials are all over the place, constantly reaching in your pocket, right? Now, that's okay if the king can use that money to protect your land and to safeguard your liberties. But if he can't, then that's when you run into the real problem. And if you look at the text of Magna Carta, one of the chief complaints there is that the king has failed his responsibility to preserve what we have, right? So people in this period will pay. They'll pay the tax if they have to, but you have to give them something on the back end. And when they don't get that, yeah, absolutely, you see in his campaign, he has to send letters back to England pleading for more help. People are not bringing knights to help him out. They have no interest in it. If he can get back the land, fantastic. But they're certainly not going to use their own resources to help him do it. So he finds by the time he gets to the end, once Bouvines is over, he looks around and realizes there is no other place to get allies. Not on the continent, not in England. He has to go home. So that's definitely an important part of the equation.
Well, I think that Philip Augustus was doing the same thing, of course, in terms of raising money. And in fact, as you know, and probably just didn't have time to very much talk about, Philip Augustus really reformed the whole bureaucratic structure, if you will. And indeed, he maybe even created the bureaucratic structure of the French kingdom, and was able to raise significant amounts of money. My question, though, would be, to what extent were the advisors of Philip Augustus, who were running the bureaucracy and advising him on all other things, responsible for some of the kinds of military decisions that Philip made? I mean, I think he was very fortunate in having sort of excellent help, shall we say. Yes.
Yes, and this is the question, right? And your first point is absolutely correct. I should comment on it. The bureaucratic structure produced in Philip's reign is amazing. It's certainly, I think it's safe to say, it's the most complex system in that region of the world since Charlemagne. In terms of increasing tax revenues by actually having royal officials do proper collections throughout, through careful accounting and bookkeeping and application of the laws and whatnot. Yeah, he's absolutely raking in the money, and Baldwin has crunched some of the numbers of how much revenue is flowing in, and it is substantial. He is making an absolute king's hoard, if you will, right? As far as the battle goes, yes, I mean, that's always the question, right? How much credit do we give to Philip as opposed to his subordinate commanders, right? Probably the most important one at Bouvines is Guerin, the bishop-elect of Sens, who is leading the right flank of cavalry and is really, he's leading these sort of short cavalry charges where he charges and then pulls back and charges and pulls back and charges and pulls back and attrits the left flank of the imperial army. And undeniably, that is his initiative that he is doing, right? So there is some glory to be shared on the battlefield. However, where I give Philip credit, though, is in the run-up to Bouvines, over half his army is across the bridge. And he hears that the imperial army is coming, and he has to make the decision about whether to continue crossing and to continue to retreat or whether to stand and fight. He makes the decision to halt the advance, to move those troops back over. He arranges them and makes space for them, stiffens the line, and enters personally into the combat. And so I really see him as that kind of grand director of affairs. Even though the key battle is being fought on the right flank by someone else, Philip is in charge during the battle. And so, I have to give him credit as well. Yeah. Always a good question, though. You always want to say, who really does this go to? Does it go to the commander, or does it go to one of his subordinates? Yeah. Yeah.
As Philip takes over the territories like Normandy, et cetera, and he's kicking the English barons out, how does he consolidate power there and set up administration in the new territories to consolidate his holds in those new territories as he takes them? Right.
So there's a couple keys there. Number one, you have to take the castles. As you move in, you're not necessarily going to be fighting against field armies all the time. What you're doing is reducing fortresses, taking out the garrisons, and replacing them with your own soldiers, right? Once those strategic castles are acquired, that enables you to have regional control over the rest of the places. And then you're simply going to move in the royal officials to operate out of those fortresses and the fortified cities. And you leave small garrisons of soldiers along where you go, right? It's very much still the time of sort of positional warfare, where if you have the castle here, 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 and here, you can pinch off a certain amount of territory, control the roads in between, and extract monies from all the people going back and forth. And so that's the chief method of doing it. Once the field armies of the English are gone and there's no substantial resistance, then those castles become less important because you're the only game in town. But that's what you have to do. You have to grab territory and be able to control it with those fortresses. And that explains why it's kind of a slow creep. You can't just have a massive sort of mass wave invasion where you take all of France, right? It's not going to happen. You have to grab piece by piece by piece and establish yourself before moving on to the next one. The armies are smaller. You may only have 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers at your disposal at a time. You simply don't have the manpower to do it. So grabbing those fortresses is the important bit.
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit about your craft in terms of how you know what you know, how you research it? How far back can you go in European history and still rely upon original source material? How far back until you're just relying upon the words of previous historians, and how trustworthy are they? Yeah, that's the dilemma for medievalists. We do not have the embarrassment of riches that modern historians have, right? And so instead of having thousands and thousands and thousands of documents and learning how to sort through that, we have, for my book on Acre, I had really 14 major sources, right? Now, they're lengthy sources, and they're coming from different parts of the world, so you have to adopt kind of a healthy skepticism about them and really do a lot of comparative work on every bit of information they give you. Witness sources are ideal if you can get them, but the discussion in the field in the last 20 years is that they are not necessarily the best source, right? Sometimes the better one is the person who writes later after interviewing participants and getting their accounts and kind of sorting them out, right? But you can go very far back, very far back. We always rail in the medieval world about the so-called Dark Ages, right? We just laugh about it because they really weren't that dark. There was a lot of material being churned out. What we have been able to say about even the 7th and 8th centuries is frankly amazing. The amount that we know about the economy, where people lived, what the populations were, what their activities were. So you can go quite far back. There are moments where we wish we had more, or there's a sort of a dearth, depending on you say, well, I'm looking at this particular king, and you say, oh, there's only one major source for his reign. I wish I had more than that. There's only limited things you can say, right? Different regions of the continent are more productive in terms of written documents than other ones. So it can be scattershot. But the general idea is before the year 1000, I heard a historian say this at St. Louis this year, before the year 1000, you're putting together a 500-piece puzzle with 92 pieces. Right? Before the year 1000. After the year 1000, however, I think you would be surprised at just how much there is. So, for example, for King Henry II, Richard, and John, we have the annual financial rolls for every single year of their reign, paid by the sheriffs to the exchequer twice a year. We have all those documents. It is thousands and thousands of pages of records. Charters, we have thousands of charters. I mean, there is actually quite a lot of evidence. It's too much to go through in a lifetime. I was talking with somebody this summer about, they were just looking at documents from the University of Paris, and it was hundreds of thousands of documents. I mean, so for sometimes it's quite the treasure trove, and you have a lot to go through. Other times it's a little limited, but we medievalists have to be very careful. You have to be very skeptical, very careful, and very cautious before reaching conclusions. Always allowing the caveats, saying, I tell my students all the time, I'd love to give you the answer for that. I just don't know. We don't know. That is a gap until we find something new. Yeah, it can be an arduous thing.
I'd like to speak to that too, because I was just reading a new biography of Charlemagne by Janet Nelson, probably the queen of early medieval historians. And in her introduction, she talks about the source problems, but even for this period from, let's say, 750 to 820, there are 7,000 to 8,000 charters or documents. Most of these either legal documents reporting a court case, or more likely donations of land to churches and other things. That's a lot of documents. I mean, not the kind of thing a modern historian would think of, but it's still a lot. Yeah. And there are at least a dozen chronicles, some of them somewhat copying one another, but also adding their own comments. So even in an earlier period, there's a lot of information. It doesn't mean that there's everything that we would like to have. Right. And indeed, we know often about things that existed at one time that are now gone forever, or we think they are. Every
right.
once in a while something turns up. But by the time you get to Philip Augustus, there are really tens of thousands of legal documents and of court cases and official financial records and court records and so on. So there's a lot of information. Again, not the kind of thing that you would get in a presidential library, but still, right. Even the person who writes the presidential biography can't go through everything that's there. Yeah. So there's a lot of material, much more, I think, than people realize.
And I would add to that in a general sense that, talking about the regional differences, so we have these financial rolls I mentioned for the King of England. We have one for Normandy. They have not survived because there is a thing that later comes called the French Revolution, which an awful lot of stuff is destroyed. And so for some places it is patchy, and for some places it is excellent. But yeah, Rich is absolutely right. It can be, depending on where you're looking, an embarrassment of riches. And I know sometimes when I do my work, I sit there and I say, okay, I've got 5 major sources I'm going through, and I get kind of jealous of people who are doing, say, the 100 Years' War. There's to give you some sense of this, Ann Curry at Southampton, who works on Agincourt and Henry V, has assembled a database online of every identifiable English soldier who fought in the 100 Years' War. It's over 250,000 names. So, once you get to the later period, you are dealing with the kind of detail that modernists enjoy. But again, that's for the English army. It's not for the French army. We don't know as much about them. And it's for that later period where we have muster rolls, and we don't have muster rolls in earlier periods. So it can be spotty.
What language did Philip use?
French. He tried to learn Latin and couldn't figure it out.
He didn't know German.
Right. So French is it's the lingua franca. I mean, they're speaking it in the English court, they're speaking in the French court, they're speaking it at the papal court, and so you can get by with just that. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, and I don't want to use the word revolution, but were there any technological or military advancements that occurred during Philip's reign?
Yes, actually. It is sometime during the reign of Philip. Now, we don't credit it to Philip, but during the reign of Philip, the counterweight trebuchet becomes a thing. If you've seen trebuchets with the swinging arm, right, with the large weight on the end, trebuchets used to be fired by teams of men. We call them traction trebuchets. You'd have a series of ropes. I actually did this once in Denmark. We got a bunch of historians. I wish somebody had taken like a video of it. It was hilarious. All these historians were pulling the ropes, and you pull the ropes down and propel the trebuchet with manpower. One guy fell down and smashed his face open. Right? It was difficult work. Sometime in the late 12th century, early 13th century, we don't know exactly when, came the idea of putting a counterweight at the back, which increased range and increased load capacity. We just don't know when or where it happened, but it was definitely sometime 1190s into the first decade of the 13th century. So that would be one. The other one that comes back is maybe the Romans used to use a technology in their ballista called torsion power, where you'd have the twisted ropes. You twist them together, and then you unleash the ropes, and they release their energy. There's a whole argument about whether that technology was lost during the Middle Ages because the Romans used it. And then we don't see references to it afterwards. But it comes back in the early 13th century on a weapon called the springaldus, which looks like a giant elevated table with these torsion ropes ratcheting down a giant crossbow, essentially. So you have a means of propulsion, two new means of propulsion in the time that come around. And those are the major military technologies. But the Middle Ages is not one of those times of major revolutions in military tech. It is much more continuity over time and small little tweaks until you get to the 14th century where you get the advent of gunpowder. But that comes after the reign of Philip.
This may seem a silly question, but the fleur-de-lis that I see there, the gold on the blue,
Yeah.
do you know anything about that? Is that the first time it made its appearance? And what kind of flags did they used to use? Did they have a French flag before this guy Philip took over?
Right. So the fleur-de-lis, so the background, I was just talking to my colleague, Professor Abel, in the back. The gold on blue is a later development, that field. I took it because I found it on the internet and it looked pretty. But the fleur-de-lis itself had been in use for a while. The first time we see it used is during the reign of Philip's father, Louis VII. And that's when it seems to have been adopted as a symbol of the French. And then Philip picks it up and they all run with it afterwards. But in the beginning, it's actually, you see it in English imagery as well. It's kind of passed around. But it becomes exclusively French during Louis and Philip's reign. The flag, though, this is not going to be carried in the flag into battle. The flag is going to be something called the oriflamme, which is a red pointed standard with a sunburst on it. And that is the battle flag of the French in the Middle Ages, the oriflamme. So they did have both of these during Philip's time. No, not on their flag today. Today it's red, white, and blue in the three columns of color, but it's not. But there's no fleur-de-lis on it. But you still see it used quite often. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. While I have your attention, I'd be pleased to promo the next talk being given by one of my colleagues at CGSC up at Fort Leavenworth, General Sir John Monash, quote, the only general of creative originality produced by the First World War. And so look on your schedules for that. Dr. David Mills will be coming down from Leavenworth to give a talk on that. So if you're interested in World War I history, I recommend it, and hopefully I'll be here with you to see it. Thank you very much for coming out.